Step into the world of Curious Counter, where spooky stories and mysteries await. Get ready to explore strange and creepy things that might give you goosebumps, puzzling secrets and things that make you scared, what's hidden in the shadows, and learn about the not-so-normal side of our everyday world, if you're up for it. Here are some scary investigation and crime stories you would like to listen. I've been an investigator and hunter of the paranormal for longer than I care to remember, studying lore, protecting the innocent, and destroying malicious entities are just a few of the job's many requirements. In my younger years, training day in and day out with my uncle, I thought we were heroes and that I had the greatest job in the world. Now that he's dead, along with most of my friends and family, I'm not so sure. The monotony of endless travel and cheap hotels, the guilt of not being able to protect my loved ones when they needed me most, the burden of saving others. It's more weight than I ever thought would rest on my shoulders, more weight than most men can bear to carry. But enough about that. You don't need to hear some sob story. This isn't about me. This is about my latest adventure, one I almost didn't come back from. A few months ago, while digging through various news articles and police reports for choice words like bizarre and unexplainable, I came upon a tabloid piece about a man, Jack, on a business trip. He apparently became hysterical and attacked his boss, Coulter, in a hotel lobby. When asked why, he simply said that room 371, the room Coulter was assigned at the front desk, was no ordinary room, and anyone staying there was in grave danger. He said he was trying to protect his boss by explaining the situation while pulling him away and out of the hotel. Coulter resisted and fell to the floor, breaking his arm. He didn't press charges, but needless to say, their business trip and relationship were over. Normally, I stay away from these kinds of things. More often than not, they tend to be the products of nutcases. This one had all the makings of an overworked man on the verge of a mental breakdown. Still, it piqued my interest. With no other pressing cases on the table, I decided to look into it, if for no other reason than to placate my curiosity. A quick bit of research revealed that the Covenwood Inn, the hotel where Jack and Coulter were staying, only had 2 floors with room numbers ranging from 101 to 256. There was not, nor had there ever been, a room 371. This wasn't enough to build a case, but it was strange nonetheless. I couldn't find any contact information for Jack, but I found an email for Coulter on a site dedicated to networking for investors and business leaders. He responded but only gave me a brief account of the incident, not wanting to discuss specifics. In his summary, however sparse, he even described being handed a key card for room 371 before Jack grabbed him. The plot was thickening. The next order of business was to call the hotel. I did this on 3 separate occasions, spread out across the week with 3 different aliases, and spoke with 3 different staff members ranging from entry-level to management positions. In the hunting business, this is known as the rule of 3. Provided you can sift through the bullshit and identify the potential truths within, it allows for a higher chance of information retrieval without raising suspicion. It works even better if you can act and change your voice accordingly. Call number 1 was to the hotel manager. As I suspected, no matter how persistent I was, she would not comment on the matter. Call number 2 was made to lower-level management in the form of Tammy, a shift supervisor. She wasn't working on the day in question, but had heard a lot about it from coworkers. She said Jack was a lunatic. He kept screaming about a list of rules in his hotel room. I wanted to ask for more, but we were disconnected. I'm fairly certain I heard the manager come over and scold Tammy before the line went dead. Call number 3 was to the front desk. For this one, I decided on a backhanded approach. I would attempt to book the non-existent room 371 to see if the clerk would bring up the incident on his own. Upon dialing, the voice that met my ear was steady and emotionless. "Thank you for calling the Covenwood Inn. How may we be of service?" Is it possible to book a specific room? Of course, sir. Which room would you like to stay in? Room 371. One moment. There was a brief pause and the faint sound of tapping at a keyboard. Room 371 is available tonight and every night going forward. When would you like to book your stay? Impossible. Did I call the right place? Was my information wrong? So you're saying room 371. That's 3 CVN 1 is available. Yes, sir. Tonight. And every night. And this is the Covenwood Inn in Massachusetts. Indeed it is. And your hotel only has 2 floors with room numbers 101 to 256, right? Correct, sir. How then is there a room 371? There was another pause, this one considerably longer than the previous. Thank you for calling the Covenwood Inn, where we always hope you enjoy your stay. Goodbye. Well, I'll be damned. Despite my doubts, it looked like I had found my case. I just needed to do a little more research before going out on a full-fledged hunt. Most entities travel. It's doubtful that this one struck once and then moved on. If I could find its signature and establish a pattern, I could probably pick up its scent and predict its next attack. All I had to go off of was Tammy's second-hand account of Jack screaming about a list of rules. That would have to be my starting point. And down the rabbit hole I went. 5 days of non-stop research later, I stumbled upon a motherlode of paranormal activity. Dozens of accounts of mystery survival guides left in apartments, hotels, and workplaces, strange sets of rules with a sizable body count left in their wakes. My next move was clear. I had to call Al. Al was an old soul who had been around the paranormal block more than a few times. His hunting days were behind him, but he was a walking encyclopedia of knowledge. If anyone could shed some light on these lists, it was him. Al's recognizably scruffy voice cut through the receiver after just one ring. Henry, you bastard. How the hell have you been? I'm glad to know you're still alive after all this time. Would it kill you to pick up the phone once in a while? I know, Al. I'm sorry. Caught up in the gig. You know how it is. How's your heart? Still giving you trouble? Of course. But you and I both know I've been through worse hell than a few clogged arteries. To whom do I owe this call, anyway? I'm sure you didn't reach out to discuss my declining health. I've uncovered something big, Al, and I need your help. You must be big if you're calling me instead of diving in headfirst with no parachute like you usually do. Al was referring to a particular case we worked on together years ago, his last one in the field. I was a foolish and cocky son of a bitch. We followed a bad tip I received from a less than reputable source and found ourselves smack dab in the middle of a dense forest, surrounded by a coven of dreamwalkers. They're nasty creatures with an appetite for children's nightmares, only attacking those waking under the light of a full moon, which just so happened to be the case on the night we went out there. It was a trap, and we walked right into it. We managed to kick and claw our way out, but just barely. Al took most of the onslaught. I carried him out to the main road, where we were picked up by a passing truck and brought to the hospital. The physical damage was healed, but Al was never the same after that. He never said as much, but I swear he blamed me for what happened. Even if he didn't, I did. I can't ever forgive myself for that one. There are these strange survival guides being left in random locations across the country, and they're racking up quite the body count. I don't know if it's Al interjected with a heavy sigh. I know exactly what you're talking about. You should probably swing by my place to talk more about it. Al, you're across the border, over 300 miles from where I am. Damn it. Al was a stubborn man, and a lonely one at that. He probably just wanted a visit, and I couldn't really blame him. After all, I was the reason he turned into an old hermit in the first place. Whether it was the guilt over breaking his spirit years ago, or my lack of options, I made that drive and crossed state lines on my way to see Al. If anything, it would at least be good for him. It was just how I remembered it. A perfect little cottage tucked away in the middle of nowhere, far away from the outside world. It's not the house you would expect a hunter to live in, but that's how Al liked it. Small and quaint. I think it reminded him of his late wife, Ellie. She used to talk about a dream home like this one, if memory serves. Al rushed out to greet me. "There you are, you bastard. Get over here." He pulled me in for a bear hug. I reciprocated, happy to see him in person for a change. "All right, Henry. Let's go in and talk shop." We dislocated, and Al brought me inside, where I sat on the sofa. He brought me over a TV dinner, a common meal in our trade, and a beer before sitting down in the chair opposite me. "Okay, Al. What do you know? This is big. You were right about that. But..." He threw me a concerned look, indicating I might not like what he had to say. "Come on, Al. I drove hundreds of miles to hear this. It better be good." Define good. Out with it, Al. "The good news is I know what we're dealing with." I swear the man dragged out simple responses just to keep me from leaving too soon. That, or he enjoyed dangling fresh meat over my head just to watch me swipe at it and miss. Probably a little of both. And the bad news. The truth is, I've been tracking this thing for years. You're not going to be able to catch it, kid. Its course is completely random. By the time a headline shows up, she's already moved on to another town, with no trail of breadcrumbs to follow. She. Yes, she. Could be a he, but you and I know males are pretty rare. It's a witch, Henry, and a powerful one at that. Al went on to explain that the lists of rules were agreements between the witch and her victims, contracts that needed no signatures to be legally binding. Once the rules are read and comprehended by the victim, the agreement takes effect. If one or more rules are broken, a supernatural calamity will befall the victim, usually resulting in their death, at which time part of their life force is absorbed by the witch. With each soul piece she takes, she becomes more powerful. Why do folks break the rules in the first place? It's all part of the design. Most of the rules are simple spell traps dependent on time triggers. To most people, it's nonsense. Even I, with my vast knowledge of the paranormal, would be hard-pressed to not use the bathroom after 11:22 p.m. just because of a list I found on a motel dresser. How do you know all of this, Al? I learned most of it from a man who stayed at an Airbnb near Cape Cod. He found a list and broke each and every rule, but still managed to make it out of there alive. He even gave me the damn thing. What? You mean you have it right now? You've been holding out on me this whole time. Al walked over to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a sheet of paper. He then walked over to me and tossed it on my lap. "It won't do you much good. I've examined it more times than I can count." It was beautiful in a morbid sort of way. I had been studying the case for so long that it felt amazing to have a piece of the story in my hands. A physical piece of evidence I could inspect with my own eyes. Feels different from normal paper, wouldn't you say, Al? It's papyrus. I imagine the other lists are made from it too. Necessary for the spell. I turned it over and noticed a dark splotch near one of the bottom corners. Al, what's this? A stain, I guess. Probably wine spilled from the last guy who had it. That wasn't wine. I was sure of it. I raced over to Al's bookshelf, grabbed a copy of Demonic Dealings by Jack Grovewood, and began flipping through the pages. Al, what do we know about witch deals? Aside from these ones, they're verbal contracts between a witch and a human. One wish granted in exchange for a piece of their soul. Why? What are you getting at? I found the page I wanted and scoured the text until I came upon an image. Aha! I held up the picture of two hands dripping red over a chalice. And how are the deals sealed, Al? With blood from both parties. We know all of this, Henry. This is different. She doesn't need permission, and there's no wish granted. You break a rule, and you're toast. That's it. Clearly, this type of contract doesn't need blood from the victim, but what if it still needs the witch's blood to bind the soul piece to her when it's done? I held up the list and pointed to the dark spot. Al thought it over for a moment before it all sank in. You genius son of a bitch. Are you saying we have the witch's blood right here? That's exactly what I'm saying now. But what does that matter? We can't cast a summoning spell without fresh blood, no older than 2 months. I received this ages ago. I know, but there's no statute of limitations on blood packs. That's how ghosts are able to make deals with demons, witches, and the like. If we create our own list with identical ink and paper and smear some of this blood onto it, it should work the same and bind the witch to the deal. When we break the rules, she'll have to show up to collect. Then, well, we kill her. Al shot me a dirty look. Are you insane? Another one of Henry's misguided tightrope walks. I'm glad I'm alive to see this one. We don't know the conditions of the spell. There could be more to it than this. You want to risk it backfiring, or worse, it actually working and us getting ourselves killed by the most powerful witch we've ever gone up against. As the words rolled off his tongue, I sensed the excitement in his voice. He was dying to work another case after being on hunter's leave all these years. Al, are you in or not? He turned his head for a moment, then turned back to meet my gaze. You bet I am. Another week of research and gathering materials later, we had what we needed: witch-killing instruments, stakes soaked in the Dead Sea, and welding torches, and a new list of rules uniquely equipped for Al's cottage. All lights were off by 10:41 p.m. Leave the bedroom door closed at all times. Do not step outside after sunset. If anyone knocks at the front door after 3:45 p.m., do not answer it. If your television set is on, do not tune in to Channel 9. After spreading a sample of blood from the previous list on the back corner, we got to work breaking as many rules as we could. 12 hours passed. We left the lights on all night, opened the bedroom door, tuned the TV to Channel 9, which was just plain static, and walked outside after sunset. Then we waited for an inevitable knock at the door. It never came. We waited and waited and waited, sitting on the sofa with stakes and torches in hand, but there was no activity. None whatsoever. Even without the knocking, something should have happened. We had broken 4 of the 5 rules. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Al turned to me and shook his head. Looks like it was a bust, kid. Just as I was about to swallow my failure and admit defeat, a gust of wind pushed the front door open, and a clean-cut man in his 50s, gray hair, gray mustache, waltzed in with a smile on his face. It looked as though it was a male witch after all. Hello, boys. Looking for me? Al and I raced over and pushed our stakes through him. There was no effect. We then held our torches up and attempted to burn his skin. Again, no reaction. This was not good. With a flick of his wrists, the man was able to swing us through the air and pin us against opposite walls via an unseen force. No spell was recited. Just pure, powerful magic. Is that any way to treat a guest? We tried to break free, but it was no use. I didn't have to show up, you know. Using my blood was a good idea, but your list was voided the moment the ink touched the page. Without my handwriting, the thing's useless. He cackled as we squirmed. I just couldn't resist seeing this for myself. 2 humans meddling in my affairs, attempting to draw me out of hiding. Whatever did you think you would accomplish? He shut the door behind him, walked over, and sat down on the sofa where we had previously been seated. And the stakes and fire. What a great laugh that was. You know, as a powerful witch, I can ward myself from just about anything. With enough soul shards, you can pretty much render yourself invincible, and I have plenty to spare. What do you want? I screamed out, impatient as ever. Al looked at me wide-eyed, almost as if to say, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Punishment, of course. You may not have broken the rules of one of my actual contracts, but that doesn't mean I can't dole out some just desserts. Just then, there was a knock at the door. What's this? The witch spoke in a delighted tone. It looks as though we have more guests. Please come in. The door swung open, and two figures walked in. Two figures I recognized. It was none other than my uncle and Al's wife. They walked over to us, and the witch released her hold on us. Aren't you happy to see your loved ones back from the dead? Without warning, their forms changed. Their fingernails changed into claws that bent and curled towards the carpet. Their mouths opened at unnatural angles, revealing rows of sharp teeth that protruded outward. Finally, their eyes met at the center of their heads, creating a single pool of yellow light swirling into itself with a life of its own. Then they attacked. Al and I jumped and darted around the room, but it was no use. They were too fast, and their arms were too long. No matter what we did, they kept pulling us in and tearing away our flesh, bit by bit. Before long, we were both being tightly squeezed in their arms, our pained cries echoing through the house. Oh, what's wrong? Don't you humans live for tender embraces? It doesn't get any more loving than this. Just as our spines were about to break, Hal did the unthinkable. Wait, I want to make a deal. All at once, the creatures loosened their grip, and the witch spoke, just as surprised as I was. Oh, now that's something I didn't expect. Tell me, Al, what did you have in mind? A piece of your soul for your safety. Sorry, but that just isn't worth it. I'd rather see you bleed. Al looked over at me as a single droplet rolled down his cheek. Let the kid go, and you can take me now. The whole damn soul is yours. The creatures vanished, and the witch's face lit up. Al, what are you doing? You can't. The witch put her fingers together, and my mouth was clamped shut. Sorry, kid. I'm getting too old for this. I'm tired. My wife's gone. My daughter's gone. You're the only family I have left. The witch chimed in. You have yourself a deal. Al looked over to me one last time with a smile. At this point, my face was soaked in tears. I never blamed you. I may not be your dad, but I would have been so proud to call you my son. And with that, they disappeared, and I never saw them again. I fell to the floor, breathless. It was over. There was nothing I could do. Somehow, some way, that witch will die. I will bleed his corpse, rip apart the flesh, bury the bones, and salt the earth if I have to. And I'll tell you what, I'm going to save Al while I'm at it. It was 3:00 a.m. on July 17, 2004, when I found myself outside the site of the seventh murder in 4 weeks. My partner Jim Callister and I had been the first responders to this particular incident, the first two to survey the carnage before the forensics team and cleanup crew made it to the scene. We had followed a twisted breadcrumb trail of broken glass, debris, and blood up to the master bedroom, where we found the mutilated body of the occupant, torn in half and adorned with tattered linen and ruby-tinged goose feathers. Her name was Sally McMahon. She was a 74-year-old woman who, according to her neighbors, lived alone and seldom had any visitors. There was no reason for anyone to so much as let their dog run amok through her garden, let alone kill her, yet here we were. We had ruled out the idea of it being an animal attack after the first victim's post-mortem, a local farmer who we found torn to pieces in his ransacked kitchen. Initially, we had put it down to being a bear or even a particularly aggressive wolf, but that was before a spooky-sounding forensic pathologist from the local hospital called in to Sheriff Alverson's office to gravely relay to us that the bite marks found on the farmer's body were thoroughly baffling. Allegedly, the corpse was covered with human teeth marks, and more alarmingly, teeth marks that were deemed unrecognizable. We had all hoped that the following incidents, when they happened, wouldn't turn out the same way, that they were animal attacks, or that the post-mortem would yield different results. Of course, even after this seventh murder, some officers who were on the scene were still throwing around the idea that these were all just the work of one very aggravated bear. I had been standing outside the house, taking long, frequent drags on a cigarette, and listening to the chatter of the other officers as the faulty streetlight above me played a fierce tug-of-war with the night. The detective assigned to the case, Donald Evans, emerged in the doorway and began to walk toward me, his face ashen even in the mottled orange glow. "Officer Lemansky." Call me Michael," I said, extending my hand out to shake his. "You're Detective Evans, right?" "Yeah, that's me. It's my understanding that you were one of the first responders." "That's right," I said, my words muffled by the smoke that exited my mouth in a ghostly wisp. "I get that these incidents are uncommon around these parts, to say the least. But I need you to tell me if you or Officer McAllister noticed any details that stood out from the other crime scenes." I forced my mind to delve back into the last hour and a half. Jim and I had entered the house at around 3:10 a.m., first noticing an upturned cabinet and broken glass strewn at the bottom of the staircase. Upon reaching the landing, we found yet more ravaged furniture and broken glass, and more than that, a thick crimson trail of blood that led into the master bedroom. My mind drew a blank. It was gruesome, but nothing that really stands out from the others. The handprints. There were handprints on the ceiling. I said. "What?" Evans nearly choked. "There were bloody handprints on the walls and on the floor, but there were some on the ceiling too." Are you sure they were handprints?" Evans stammered. "Sure as I am. We're having this conversation right now." "Bloody handprints. Pronounced too. It wasn't like the perp threw the victim up there or anything like that. You can go and check for yourself." How did? Shit. Evans jogged back to the house and disappeared up the stairs. I looked over at Jim, who had been sitting on the hood of the car and staring into space ever since the forensics team had gotten here. I could tell the case was weighing on him. With each passing incident, he grew quieter. His mind was on something, though. The handprints on the ceiling had thoroughly frightened and confused the hell out of me. All of the murders up until this point had been grisly, but none had really possessed any anomalous details aside from the lack of fingerprints and the bizarre teeth marks, both of which we were all used to by now. I was about to attempt to have a conversation with Jim when Evans rushed back out of the house. He looked even more somber than he had before, almost sickly. "You were right about the handprints. We're going to take samples and see if we can identify the perpetrator from that." He almost sounded choked up. "Right. I didn't have much hope for that. No attempts at DNA fingerprinting or blood sampling had progressed the case at all in the last 3 weeks. The forensics team is saying that the corpse is covered in bite marks. Human. Probably. We'll have to wait for the postmortem. It could still turn out differently. We don't know yet." We knew all too well. Evans spoke with the same vain expectation that the other local officers did, and it was becoming apparent that there was no way to downplay this as something less serious than it was. There was a person out there doing this. Someone who was savagely butchering people, seemingly without reason. These were serial killings, yet the words serial killer had yet to be used by our sheriff or even Detective Evans. "You and McAllister can head home," Evans said, defeat lurking beneath his gruff, authoritative tone. "It's been a long night, and the forensics team will be here for a while." I wished Evans good luck in the hunt for any further evidence and motioned to Jim to get in the car. I looked back at the house as I turned the vehicle at the end of the street, knowing that soon the dawn would pull the obsidian shroud from the street and the townspeople would awaken to yet more unanswered questions. A week later, my exhausted brain was jump-started one slow morning by a phone call while I was at my desk. I didn't recognize the number. "Mikhail Lemansky. Who am I speaking to?" "Hi, Mr. Lemansky. This is Alice Corman from the Jefferson Herald. I was wondering if you had any additional information on the ongoing investigation into the string of murders in Torkton." Her words were a shot of adrenaline that went straight to my head. Or perhaps any clarifying comments on today's story that could make it to a later publication. "How the hell do you know about this? How did you get this number?" I barked sternly. 3 days ago, we received detailed information about a series of killings in Torkton. Do you read the newspaper at all, sir? As if on cue, the most recent copy of the Jefferson Herald was slammed down in front of me by the exasperated Sheriff Alverson, the bold headline perched arrogantly atop the cheap, fragile paper. Terror in Torkton. The Sawney Bean murders. I looked up at Alverson's scowl, and then spoke into the phone. Excuse me for 1 minute. I ended the call immediately and set the phone down. I perused the article with growing disgust, already put off by the tasteless reference to the Scottish cannibal in the headline. In the early hours of July 17th, Jefferson County Police were called to the scene of a suspected home invasion, only to be met with a grisly discovery: the mutilated, cannibalized body of Sally McMahon, 74. This is said to be the seventh in a string of similar horrific incidents that the authorities have been keeping quiet about so as not to frighten the citizens of Torkton. Looking further down the page, I saw my last name appear as well as Jim's. I looked up at Sheriff Alverson in shock. "What the fuck is all this?" I exclaimed. Alverson's steely gaze persisted. "I was hoping you'd know." He said it dryly. My mind raced. "I never told the press, asterisk. I know that this is the kind of stuff that they love to sink their teeth into, especially round here where nothing happens," and a thought popped into my head. Jim. He had left his gun and badge on Alverson's desk the day after the 7th killing, and no one had been able to contact him since then. I couldn't think of anyone else who would have tipped off the press about this whole ordeal, because no one else at the scene, no matter how harrowed, had been quite as out of their minds as Jim was. It seemed like the ever-irate sheriff had read my mind. "You think this was McAllister?" "It looks that way." The only other person who would have been liable to let any information escape the scene was the lady who called it in, and we made a point not to give her all the details after finding out about the bite marks. We spared those details from past witnesses too. Well, no one in this fucking precinct has heard from him since last week's incident, and no one has been able to contact him. "Is he married, Lemansky?" the sheriff asked. "No." "Kids? Girlfriend?" "He lives alone, Sheriff," I said, my voice descending into an unimpressed monotone. Yeah, Jim had just gotten up and left. His personality had been melting away ever since the case was opened. It wasn't like him at all. But Alverson was, and had always been, an uptight, neglectful bitch. In the 8 years that I'd worked here, he'd never once made a real effort to get to know me or any of the other officers, for that matter, despite the fact that he had very little else to do. Perhaps he had a chip on his shoulder because he was laid off from a big shot position in Seattle or something, but it's not like his dismissive, cold self would ever tell me that story. I knew what was about to come out of his mouth. "Well, Lemansky, you know the dipshit better than anyone else here, so it falls on you to pull him out of wherever he's holed up and talk to him." "With all due respect, Sheriff," I said, almost gagging on my words. What would I even say to him? "The papers have already been printed." Alverson cut me off. "You tell him whatever you've got to tell him. Have him head down to the Jefferson Herald and tell them that forensics screwed up and that it was an animal attack. I can't have these bastards making us look like we aren't handling this, so they're going to pull that goddamn headline right now. This is a quiet town, and I don't want those fucking Hoover boys down here. Cannibalism. Jesus Christ." Alverson was perhaps the only human being in the world who still used the term Hoover boys to describe the FBI after 1969. There was a joke about his ever so confidently speaking outdated lingo among the officers. Unbeknownst to him, I shot up from my desk, unwilling to tolerate the unanswered what-ifs of the situation. "Sheriff, what if they don't pull the headline? What happens then? What if they don't retract their statements?" Alverson, ever angry, stared at me with an expression that suggested that he was about to blow his top again. He shook his head as his mind attempted to come up with some kind of solution. "Right, we interview every single man. No, every single person above the age of 16 in Torkton. We get officers out there going door to door, demanding mandatory questioning for every man or woman, boy, and girl above 16 years. They can tell anyone who refuses that they will be immediately put down as a suspect. I can't. I cannot have the local people think we aren't handling this. It had everything to do with how we appeared, not what we were actually doing. Bastard. Sure, it mattered that the people of Torkton felt like we were confident and assured in the way we dealt with things, but the fact of the matter was, we weren't handling it at all. We were taking blind swings at an invisible assailant who had us all scared shitless. Sheriff. I began. Go find McAllister. He grumbled. I pondered arguing for a second, and then decided that there was no way I was winning this fight. All right. I tried contacting Jim earlier in the week to no avail, so I knew that my only real option was to head to his place. That is, if he hadn't packed all of his belongings together and jumped on the next plane to the East Coast. As Alverson sauntered back to his office, I hurriedly tidied up the small mess of papers on my desk and headed out to the lot, opting to take my own car instead of one of the precinct's vehicles. I felt a weight on my shoulders, as though the thick, humid air was pressing down on me. Jim's sudden absence was simply another rung on this ladder of stress. I was already thinking nonstop about what I had seen, and when I'd once again find myself staring at another grisly picture just like it. The rain clouds began to spit as I drove through the downtown area, their dark gray forms harbingers of an oncoming thunderstorm. Jim lived in an apartment complex about 4 miles away from the station, fairly close to the edge of town, but far enough away from the center that very few people cared about any renovations that it may have needed. I had only ever been there once to drop Jim off when his car was in for repairs, but it wasn't hard to find. The rain hammered down aggressively on the exterior of my car, the relentless metallic banging making me feel as though I was trapped inside a tin can at a shooting range. I pulled into the parking lot and grabbed an anorak that had slipped from the seat to the foothold in the back of the car, thinking of what exactly I would say to Jim. That is, of course, if he hadn't locked himself in his bathroom. And, well, you know, that wasn't an idea that I was particularly fond of entertaining. I exited my car and walked briskly to the door of the apartment, dialing his room number into the panel by the door and hitting call as the rain lapped hungrily at my shoes. Jim, it's Mikhail. If you're in there, open up. I'm not here to drag you back to Alverson. I'm just here to talk. Nothing came through the receiver. Looking across the lot, I saw Jim's car parked in the looming shadow of a pine tree. I tried calling again, this time trying to sound noticeably irritated. I know you're in there, man. It's been a tough week for everyone who's on that case, but I've got to talk to you. Besides, it's coming down out here, and I'm cold as all hell. Open the damn door. The receiver crackled suddenly, and a hoarse voice spilled from the speaker. Mikhail. Jesus, come on up. I pulled the door open and wasted no time in bothering myself with the elevator. I dashed up the stairs to the second floor and marched down the corridor to his room. The door was open slightly, the deadbolt resting on the frame. I had barely even rapped on the door twice before Jim pulled it open, his eyes wide and a revolver in his right hand. For Christ's sake. I flinched and almost fell backward at the sight of the weapon's moss staring me in the face. Jim lowered it and spoke through deep breaths and an apparent lump in his throat. I had to make sure it was you, Mike. You heard me on. Whatever. I said this, perplexed by Jim's evidently rampant paranoia, but unwilling to make him feel any more uncomfortable than he already was. It's me, man. It's me. What the hell is this all about? I asked, gesturing at the weapon. You better come in, he said. I followed Jim into his dimly lit apartment. I had expected it to be far messier than it actually was. There were no takeout boxes littering the floor or sloppily stacked up on top of one another, and no offensive smells emanated from the kitchen. Jim had clearly been drinking, however. On his coffee table sat a quarter-full bottle of cognac, next to a cheap-looking whiskey glass. How long have you been working on that? I said it with a spiritless chuckle. Couple days, I guess. Strong stuff. You want any? His words swayed like a tree in the breeze. I'm good. Jim, I'm going to be frank with you. I came here from the station. I saw the newspaper, and Alverson needs you to get in touch with the Jefferson Herald and tell them to pull that head. Fuck Alverson. Those were not words spoken by the liquid voice in his blood. They were assured, steady, and serious. Fuck Alverson, and fuck his callous bullshit. He's handled this about as well as a blind shrew in a knife fight. I wouldn't even dream of bringing what I found out to him because he'd have me in jail before I'd even gotten the whole story out. And believe me, Mike, I found some stuff out. I found some goddamn stuff out. What did you find out? I asked, bewildered. You're going to think I'm just a drunk asshole who snapped at the sight of too many spilled internal organs. But you're my closest damn friend here, and I trust you're going to listen to me. I'm listening. I said, firstly, yeah, I did give the Herald that information, and there is no way in hell I'm having them pull the story. No one is safe here, and they need to know what's going on so they can take as many precautions as they can. The killer has no connection to any of the victims. Anyone could be the next casualty. Hold on. You think you know who the killer is? He gave me a steely, sincere look. My blood ran cold as disbelief flooded my veins. Jim was completely serious. Somewhere inside my head, logic and fantasy were locked in a fierce duel, and fantasy was winning. Jim. I said it through nervous breaths. Do you know who the killer is? If you do, how the hell did you find out? I'm not a detective, Mike. Shit, I'm barely a police officer, but I think I might actually have some idea. Go on. Jim poured himself another shallow glass of cognac. I used to frequent a bar downtown, the Foxhole. You know it. There was a retired old park ranger who would always be there on Friday nights, and he had a catalog of stories from his time. And we'd all sit around and listen to him. One night, I want to say about 6 months ago, he told a story that he said was his last call before he retired. It happened last year. It went like this. A hiking party of about 6 people got stranded in the deep woods in Mount Pilchuck State Park and wandered off the trail by accident, I guess. 2 of the 6 people came back. 2. A woman named Estelle Palmer and a man named Reuben Grundy. Grundy was in a hell of a state when the Rangers found them. He allegedly said that he had no idea where the other 4 people had gone, and that they had wandered off into the night. Here's where it gets even weirder. Palmer said that the night before they had been found, there were still 3 of them, plus another man, I think. Palmer had been in and out of sleep, and she swore that she saw Grundy follow the other guy into the woods when he was going to piss or something. The man never came back, but Grundy did 10 minutes later. She said he looked different, thinner and taller, and insisted that he'd had blood all around his mouth. She'd felt this overwhelming fear and just pretended like she was asleep. Of course, her story was written off as delirious rambling. Jim cleared his throat and took another swig. Something about the story just kind of gave me a genuine feeling of dread that none of this guy's other stories had quite done. Then the old bastard puts the cherry on top. A week later, the U.S. Forest Service finds remains in the woods with what were presumed to be human teeth marks on them, but they're so pulverized that they can't place exactly who they were. Grundy and Palmer are both interviewed again, but nothing comes of it. Palmer even tells the same story and says that she knows what she saw, but they write it off again. I told the old man before closing time that night that he'd scared the hell out of me, but that I didn't believe him. And he just looked at me with this deadpan expression and said, "Look it up, son." So I did, and what do you know? It happened. Multiple different news sources covered the story. It fucking happened. Was barely covered on TV. Right? I started, but Pilchuck State Park is huge. The surrounding area is. Reuben Grundy lives in Torkton, Mike. He owns a ranch. He fumbled around with a mess of documents on the coffee table. Estelle Palmer used to live in Torkton too, literally a quarter mile down the road from Grundy. She'd lived here her whole life, by the look of things. Are those police records? I asked. Jim gave me an irritated side-eye and continued. The point is, after she came back from that expedition, she moved 4 towns away. She packed up and left in about a week, selling the farmhouse she lived in to someone who'd been on her ass about buying it for years. Her childhood home. From what I read, whether or not Reuben Grundy was responsible for those people disappearing, she saw something happen in those woods that made it so she couldn't even stand to be near him. Logic struggled onward in its ongoing battle inside my brain. It strained and strained, but superstition's blade was far too sharp. Maybe she was a whack job. I said, "You know what towny folks are like. They live in the same place all their lives, and clean bill of mental health," Jim exclaimed, waving a crumpled medical record in my face, clearly taken from a local clinic. No history of schizophrenia, depression, BPD, or even so much as a panic attack. No prescribed medications. It's entirely possible that we could put what she saw down to hunger, dehydration, or, on the off chance, maybe even the delayed effects of a hallucinogenic trip. But the fact of the matter is that this woman up and left in a matter of days after that incident. It's not like Torkton's right next door to Mount Pilchuck, either. Jim dropped the medical record to the floor and shakily pulled up another document. He was excited, terrified, or both. "So, look here. Her new address is in May Creek." Jim, you're chasing a roller coaster of a story here," I said. "If we take this to Alverson, he's going to give us a whole spiel about how we're idiots and then take it upon himself to rehire me, just so he can fire me. We take it to Evans, and he's going to think we're on a wild goose chase because he's a guy who deals with career criminals in Seattle and the odd home invasion. He's probably been with the force for, 2 or 3 years. Face it, Mike, our higher-ups are stuck scratching their heads, and we might actually have a lead. I know it sounds crazy, I know it's a long shot, and it's dumb luck that I heard that story, but we may have an actual suspect." In the moment, Jim's obsessive joining of the dots had rendered me dumbfounded, unable to think straight. "So you're saying the killer is Reuben Grundy?" Jim blurted out. "Maybe I am just another drunk asshole who wishes he was a big-shot detective. And maybe I'm completely wrong. But if there's even a chance that I'm right, we have to do something." Jim had a point, even in the midst of his fanatical behavior. Halverson didn't care, and Evans, despite leading the charge, was being eaten up by his own fear. I saw it screaming behind his eyes the night of Sally McMahon's murder. "All right, what's the plan?" I asked. "We visit Estelle Palmer in May Creek, and we ask her about Grundy." Jim said this through shaking breaths. What he was like, if he seemed different during or after the hiking trip, all that jazz. If we can convince her to help us beyond just talking to us, then maybe we actually have a chance at communicating it to Evans. Either that or she chases us out of her house with a double barrel for even asking. I said it dryly. "Ever the pessimist," Jim retorted. I laughed. "Get some fresh clothes on. Sober up, and let's get our asses to May Creek." Jim and I arrived at Estelle Palmer's residence in May Creek an hour later, having backtracked along numerous roads due to the exhausted GPS in my car. We parked across from Palmer's house at number 5, Fairbank Street. The place was not at all what I had anticipated. I had expected us to pull up next to an overgrown lawn brimming with tall weeds and a crudely arranged patio that led up to a dingy porch with a grimy screen door. Perhaps there would have been a sign hammered onto the wall made of plywood, and scrawled on it in red paint would have been the words, "Trespassers will be shot." It was nothing like that. If anything, it was not unlike any of the other idyllic-looking houses in May Creek. The lawn was a healthy burst of green, each blade of grass seemingly trimmed down to exactly the same size, and just by the curb lay a toy truck that must have belonged to a child. Jim swept his hair out of his eyes and opened the door of the car. "Well, here goes. We either get our answers or we get a door slammed in our faces." We approached the door, peering through the living room window and catching sight of a woman sitting in a reclining chair, watching a young boy of no more than 3 years of age play on the floor. She looked up as Jim rang the doorbell and stood up to exit the living room, motioning to the toddler to stay where he was. Estelle Palmer swung the door open, a sense of immediate irritation glinting in her eyes. She was about 38 years old, with long, dirty blonde hair that fell to her shoulders. Noticing her annoyance, I began to speak. "Mrs. Palmer." "Miss, I'm not married," Estelle said. "Right, Miss Palmer." Jim took over. "My name's Jim McAllister, and this is Michaela Mansky. We don't mean to upset you, but we're cops," she snapped. Jim was visibly surprised. "I figured. Where are you from?" "Sultan." "Don't tell me you're from Seattle." "Twerkton," I said. Her glare narrowed even further. "It's our understanding that you used to live there." "Yes. What's it to you?" She seemed even more defensive now. "We came to inquire about." Jim struggled over unnecessary eloquence, even though he fully expected to receive the cold shoulder. Miss Palmer's irritation reached its peak, and she began to shut the door. "It's about Reuben Grundy," Jim finally managed. She stopped and peered through the crack between the frame and the door. Her annoyance had dissipated, and worry flooded her eyes. "You can come in," she finally said that, ushering us inside. The interior of the house was as picturesque as the exterior. The staircase was adorned with paintings of famous North American mountains, and the kitchen was clean and well organized. Estelle led us into the living room, where the boy, whom I presumed to be her son, looked up at us with that wide-eyed, curious expression that is so common in young children. "Baby, go play in your room, okay?" Estelle said to the boy. He looked down at the plastic dinosaur he was playing with, then back at his mother, before picking up the toy and sauntering down to the end of the hallway. Before Jim or I could get a word out about how sweet her kid was, her worrisome expression returned. "I haven't seen Reuben in over a year," she said. "When I moved here, he used to call my cell 5 times a week before I changed numbers. I didn't tell him I was moving here. Of course I didn't. What the hell's he done?" "It's not what he's done," I said. "It's what we think he might have done." "Miss Palmer," Jim started. "Please, it's just Estelle." She said it softly, seeming far less vexed by our presence than she had been minutes before. "Estelle," Jim said, "the situation is this. My friend and I have reason to believe that Reuben Grundy may be linked to a series of violent serial killings in Twerkton. However, it's little more than a hunch, and the police investigation has been a complete mess from the outset, so we need your help. It's my understanding that you knew Reuben for most of your life." Estelle sat down in the reclining chair, motioning for us to sit down on the couch. "My whole life, yeah. His old man, Scott, owned this ranch down the road from my old house, and he inherited the whole place when Scott passed. We were in the same grade at school. He was always a smart, worldly guy who knew a whole lot about nature and cared a lot for the animals he reared on the ranch. Could name every damn plant in the woods." She chuckled as she reminisced. "Throughout your childhood, did he ever seem off to you at any point?" I asked. "No, never. Not once did I have him pinned as the outcast or the weirdo kid. Everyone in high school loved Reuben." "I have to ask about the hiking trip," Jim said. 4 people disappeared, and you and Reuben were the only ones who came back. You moved away a week later. What the hell happened?" Estelle's voice quaked as she spoke, fear mingling with the worry in her eyes. "Reuben," she trailed off, straining against the painful memories to force the words out. "Reuben changed on that trip. We were a week into it, and there was clearly something strange going on with him. Usually he'd be musing about conifer trees and mountain lions, but he barely spoke, and when he did, the way he talked was fragmented and hoarse, like he'd forgotten his own native language. He seemed irritated when we tried to talk to him. He didn't talk about much, but when he did, he said, her words crumpled to the floor again. I leaned forward. What did he say, Estelle? He said he was hungry. An electric current surged down my spine. The silence rang in my ears like the whining aftermath of an explosion. I hear him at night. He'd sit out by the fire longer than anyone else and mutter to himself, saying things like, "God, I'm so fucking hungry," in this voice that I'd never heard come out of him before. When it became obvious that we were lost, that's when people started disappearing. First Becca, then Miguel, then Ruth, and then Nick, the night before we were found. When Nick disappeared, I saw Reuben follow him into the forest. I didn't hear anything, but Reuben came back later without him. He looked different, sickly, pale, skinny, and somehow taller. And I swear to God, he was covered in blood. I looked over at Jim, who was staring intently at her. Jesus Christ, you drunk bastard. You brilliant, drunk bastard. You might actually be onto something. Maybe I was delirious. Maybe I was. He looked the same as ever the next day, when the park rangers found us. I just couldn't shake this feeling that I was still in danger, though. He talked in that cracked, hoarse way still. The police paid it no mind, wrote it off as the effects of dehydration, and wrote my story off as a mirage. I moved as soon as I could when I got home. I stayed with my mom in Olympia for a short while before I found a place here in May Creek. Like I said, maybe I was crazy. I'm not saying Reuben Grundy definitely killed those people, but I am certain that something in those woods got inside of him and made itself at home, and I don't think it ever left. Jim's intense concentration turned to slight confusion. What do you mean by something? Estelle gave a half smile, as though she were embarrassed. I'm not one to believe in folk tales, Mr. McAllister. Never have been, even when my old man tried to scare me to death with them when I wasn't much older than my son. But Reuben was always the same up until that trip, and he changed so suddenly. Call it what you want. A spirit, a sickness, the call of nature, whatever. Something took hold of Reuben, took him away. I'm not saying that if you investigate him, you'll definitely find the answers you're looking for, but you might want to try. Noticing that Estelle was on the verge of tears, I grabbed Jim's arm and said, "Thank you so much for your help. We should probably get going and leave you in peace." "Estelle," Jim said tentatively, "I don't suppose we could convince you to come with us." "No," she interjected. "I can't see Reuben ever again, not after what I saw in those woods. He doesn't know where I live, but I still lock every door and window at night and watch the footage from the security camera every morning. Sometimes I think if I met him again, it would lay some ghosts to rest, but something tells me those ghosts are really damn stubborn. I can't put myself in danger. We're going to go give Reuben a visit, and we will find out who's doing this, I promise." "Thank you," Estelle replied. "Good luck." She silently watched us walk down the driveway to the car, a solemn look in her eyes. Perhaps she was reliving all those memories, or perhaps she thought she had just sent us further into something we would regret being a part of. I looked over at the house one last time as I started the car. Through the living room window, I could make out a blurred picture of Estelle cradling her son in a tender embrace. We drove. I pulled the car up to Torkton Police Station at 6:15 p.m., having convinced a particularly irate Jim to stop off there first. I told him to wait in the car while I briefly went to talk to Alverson. Apparently, he'd at the very least done a good job of rounding up the local populace for questioning, as I had to sift through a chattering crowd of townsfolk who were gathered outside and inside the station. I ran to Alverson's office, rapping sharply on the door. "Who the hell is it?" Came a gritty, aggravated yell. I opened the door, and my gaze met Sheriff Alverson's cocky stare. "Where the fuck have you been, Lemansky? Have you interviewed a man named Reuben Grundy?" I asked, ignoring him. "Who?" Alverson said. "Reuben Grundy, rancher from the north end of Torkton." "Fuck, should I know?" Alverson said, taking an aggressive swig of his coffee. "Officer Barnett has a checklist. Go ask her." "Now where in God's name have you been? You got McAllister to pull that article." I slammed his door and ran to the front desk, where I found Officer Barnett busying herself with an Excel spreadsheet. I nearly collided with the desk, startling her. "Eve," I said, letting out a long-held breath. "Have you interviewed a man named Reuben Grundy yet?" Visibly confused by my urgency, she pulled up the records and perused them for about 10 seconds. It looks like we had him in a couple hours ago. We cleared him. He's not down as a suspect." "Christ, where's Detective Evans?" "Monroe." She said it absent-mindedly. "Something came up from another case, and he left a few hours later." "How long did you have Grundy in the interview room for?" My words were ablaze with insistence. 5 minutes, in and out," Barnett replied. "You've got to be fucking kidding me. They didn't even ask him about the hiking trip." "Thanks." I dashed out of the station, feeling the mystified eyes of the townspeople bore into me. Jim was waiting in anticipation, craning his neck around as I ran toward the car. I threw the door open and clambered inside. "They cleared the bastard 2 hours ago. Evans is in Monroe. We're heading to Grundy's place." "Let's go," Jim said. His tone was crawling with nerves. He had clearly expected it to come to this, but now the reality of it was sinking in. Fear brewed underneath my adrenaline rush. The sun began to exhaustedly sink below the distant mountain as we sped through Torkton, painting a crimson outline on the remaining clouds. The stench of dread began to creep in through the cracked passenger side window with every inch that the sun receded. I began to wish it would take longer to get to Grundy's ranch. Anything to stave off the terrible gut feeling. "So, Evans went to Monroe. What for?" Jim asked, obviously desperate to break the silence. "Barnett said it was another case. Whether or not that's a lie, I don't know. And I don't care. He's shit scared. And he's not here, which makes him useless." I replied. "What about Alverson?" "He wasn't even doing so much as ushering the interviewees in. She just asked me about whether or not the Herald had been convinced to pull the front page." "We're on our own, Jim." As I said that, the row of buildings on North Avenue disappeared, and Grundy's ranch came into view, sitting less than a quarter of a mile down the road from where we were. I could see a modest-looking, well-kept one-story house that sat at the head of a sprawling 2, perhaps 3, acres of land that I assumed all belonged to Grundy, as all throughout the grassland were grazing cattle, and out behind the house stood a barn, towering proudly over the tiny abode in all of its rustic glory. Doing our utmost to compose ourselves, Jim and I parked the car at the end of the gravel driveway, preparing for what would hopefully be our final visit of the day. We walked up to the front of the house, trepidation hanging like a meat hook on the otherwise calming summer breeze. I knocked on the screen door and squinted through the glass. From the end of the hallway emerged a man, standing about 6'4". He made a slow jog toward the screen door and pulled it open enthusiastically. He was as tan as one might expect a rancher to be, dressed in tattered jeans and a polo shirt, and looked to be in his late 30s. He had thinning brown hair that stuck out in tufts from underneath an ill-fitting baseball cap and a subtly auburn-colored beard. He gave a smile, his eyes glinting a little. "Can I help you boys?" he asked, his voice a chipper, gravelly song. I was thrown off for a second. I had expected a weathered, malnourished-looking man covering his face with a wide-brimmed hat. I had expected an inhuman rast. I had expected him to tell us to leave him alone. Jim jumped in. "My name's Off. Detective Cal Mariano. And this is Detective Dave Crowley. We're here regarding the town-wide questioning of the residents of Torkton." Grundy chuckled nervously, his brow wrinkling. "Oh, right. There must have been some mistake. The police already interviewed me a few hours ago. We understand, sir, and we're very sorry to trouble you," I said, joining Jim in playing the role of Detective Crowley. "See," Jim said, "it's a big operation, and the Torkton Police Department is swamped, as you might imagine. Unfortunately, they missed a couple of vital questions when interviewing a few people, and they've sent us round to get extra details." "Oh, right, of course," Grundy said, his expression softening a little. "By all means, come on inside." Jim and I stepped into the hallway as Grundy closed the door. Inside, the temperature was cool, yet an unpleasant smell hung in the air. I heard the door lock behind us. Had the door been locked before? I couldn't remember. "I hope you boys'll forgive me for the smell." He laughed. "We've got a rat infestation at the moment, and the bastards keep dying in the walls and underneath the floorboards. I try to keep the stench away as best I can until I can dig him out." "Right on, man," I said, humoring his conversation. "I had a problem with rats myself about a month ago." Grundy led us to his kitchen, which seemed to be the biggest and most impressive room in the otherwise small house, with a large granite counter spanning its entire length and a state-of-the-art cooker sitting in the middle. On the counter was a hefty pile of raw meat. "Christ," I remarked. "That's all from your cattle?" "Yes, sir," Grundy exclaimed with pride. "All locally sourced to this very ranch. The butcher shops downtown love this stuff." "I'll bet," I said. "Now, Mr. Grundy, do you mind if Detective Mariano and I ask you some questions? Shouldn't take long." "Sure. Have a seat," Grundy said, gesturing to the kitchen table. He leaned against the counter, turning his attention to the pile of meat. He still hadn't asked to see our badges. "I'm listening, boys." "Fire away." "Torkton Station clocks your interview at about 5 minutes, correct?" I asked. "Yeah, real quick in and out. I think they wrote me off because, well, I don't have a record. And I mean, look at this place. I'm busy all the time. I ain't got kids to help me around the ranch." Grundy replied. "Of course, as far as criminal charges go, your record's completely clean, Mr. Grundy," Jim said. "Mum." Grundy picked up a meat cleaver and began hacking at the steak. The instrument came down with a resounding thwack, separating a piece of the animal's flesh from the rest of the flank. "I suppose we're here to ask about the hiking trip you took in April of 2003 with a party of 5 other people," I said. Grundy exhaled loudly as though he were sighing. However, he didn't turn around or stop what he was doing. The cleaver came down again, louder this time. "Oh, of course. I was a little surprised myself that they didn't ask." "Well, let's start with a general question," I began. "What happened? What's your story?" "Huh. I got lost on the 6th day of the trip. We'd intended it to be a long trip anyhow, but we ended up having a hell of a time finding the foot of Mount Pilchuck and found ourselves lost in the woods with no idea which direction we were supposed to go. Becca disappeared on the first night that we got lost." He paused, falling into a reminiscent chasm for just a moment. "And did you know Becca well?" Jim asked. "I've known her since high school. We were going to get married this year." There was a pain in his voice. "This isn't our guy." "Shit, this isn't our guy." "I'm sorry," I said. That must have been different. I was cut off by the startling sound of the cleaver making contact with the cutting board, slicing cleanly through another piece of meat, much louder than before. Yeah, I try not to think about it. It got really hazy after that. There was this pain. It sounded like he was struggling through his sentences now. "Pain?" I asked. It started in my head, clouded my vision. "How long did the pain go on for?" Jim asked. The electric current I had felt in Estelle's living room sprung to life again. It was like a blade this time, grazing my spine with serrated teeth. I thought I had become accustomed to the stink of the dead rodents, but I knew what that smelled like. This was something different, something that carried a far more bitter scent. I hope you boys will forgive me for the smell. 2 days, spread to my hands and feet. I felt numb after that. And then, I guess I felt good, Grundy said, his voice assuming a strange, grating quality. He brought the cleaver down again, the abrasive thud accompanied by the wet sound of tearing meat. Grundy turned around to look at us. He seemed paler than he had before, his posture slightly crooked. The glint in his eyes was gone. "What do you remember about the disappearance of Nick Lee the night before you were rescued?" I inquired. He paused, setting the cleaver down. Had I blacked out? His cheekbones now seemed sunken. His eyes were even darker. His fingers were freakishly long and thin. An eerie silence waltzed with the tension that had clouded the kitchen. It was just animals at first. His voice was a sickly rasp. What? When I came back from the trip, it was just animals. Coyotes, mountain lions, and prairie dogs. None of my own cattle. What the hell are you talking about? My mouth was dry. The stinging scent of decomposition couldn't be ignored. It was just animals until the feeling came back. There was something in those woods, boys. Something that called to me. Something that wouldn't let me die. Something that told me. Grundy's voice was no longer raspy. It sounded like a ghostly moan, as though his voice were wrapped up in a violent gale. His eyes were black pits. His teeth were unnaturally long, forming yellow daggers in his mouth and forcing his face into a mocking grin. Jim stood up, backing away. Told you what, Mr. Grundy? Something that told me to eat. Grundy finally said, despite his unnatural tone. His voice was somehow cold. As a matter of fact, I killed the people on that hiking trip. I knew all of them, and I killed them and ate their flesh. Grundy said, "Oh my God. Oh my fucking God." Estelle was right. There was no logical resolution to what seemed like a crazy hunch. We were two idiots in over our heads. Why? What? Jim could hardly speak. I tried eating animals and raw meat until that feeling came back. He began circling the table. That's when I began breaking into houses. People I didn't know. People I did know. Some I liked, some I didn't care for. I tore them all apart. I stood up and stumbled away next to Jim as Reuben Grundy stalked toward us, his sharp canines protruding. Why are you telling us this? Because his icy tone slowly began to thaw. They can do what they like with me now. They can fry me. They can commit me as another criminally insane nut because they think they can control me like every other guy that went out and killed young girls because mommy was too rough on them. It helps them sleep at night to know that those sick bastards are all just human beings that they can control, one way or another. But this rage inside me, this power, a thick rope of drool fell from his mouth and pooled on the floor. There are things darker than man in this world, boys. In the soil, in the mountains, in the trees, in some dark corner of a big city, it might make you feel better to believe that other people are the cruelest thing this life has to offer, but I'm afraid that just isn't true. Grundy's mouth was unnaturally wide, the bed of spikes inside no longer resembling anything remotely human. A small glimmer sat in the center of his black eyes, like a tiny, brilliant star inside a black hole. Hunger. Jim and I dived in opposite directions as Grundy lunged at both of us, an animalistic howl erupting from his throat. I heard a chair collide with the counter as I scrambled to my feet, coming face to face with the creature that had been, or still is, Reuben Grundy. Any disbelief I had could not be justified. This nightmarish picture was here in front of me, and it was very, very real. Just as his maw opened again, and another monstrous groan emitted from within him, a gunshot rang out, and Grundy doubled over in pain, screeching with the ferocity of 1,000 banshees. Jim stood behind him, his pistol drawn. Grundy twitched violently, the motion producing a sickening crunch as though one of his bones had broken. Without a moment's hesitation, Grundy jumped from the floor to the ceiling and took off down the hallway to what I had assumed to be the staircase to the basement, skittering like an insect. His harrowing howl echoed through the house like another angry gust of wind. Drawing my own weapon, Jim, and I gave chase. The door to the basement hung wide open, and any vaguely pleasant smells in the house were now being eaten alive by the very clear aura of death. This wasn't the smell of a rat problem, that's for sure. For about 10 seconds, the house resounded with clattering and screaming coming up from the basement, and as soon as it had begun, it suddenly ceased. Dead silence. I exchanged a terrified glance with Jim. I wish I was still drunk. Jim grumbled shakily. We cautiously crept down the stairs to the basement, the light dwindling more and more with each step. My hands were gripping the pistol so hard that my knuckles had turned white, and an oasis of sweat had sprung from my palms. Jim fumbled in his coat pocket and pulled out a flashlight, turning it on and allowing the beam to illuminate the pitch blackness. The beam pierced the void that sat in the doorway, creating a tunnel of light that led our eyes to a sight that confirmed what I had feared the moment that smell hit me. The floor of the basement was piled with remains of all kinds: animal, human, arms, legs, and insides. Some had clearly been dragged down here no more than a few days ago, and some were weeks, maybe even months, old, left on the ground to decay and denied a real burial. A shuffling sound from off to the left grabbed our attention, and Grundy stepped back into view, his metamorphosis having advanced even further. He stood well over 7 feet tall, his rib cage protruding, as though his skin were vacuum-packed around it. His face was now ghoulishly inhuman, his eyes like hollow pits, and his teeth like battle-scarred tusks. Reuben Grundy perched like a gargoyle atop his morbid spoils, a king of the dead in his hall of treasures. He spoke, a baritone growl sitting underneath his strangled voice. "Sorry. The refrigerator down here is broken." A sick smile spread across his face, and it was enough to tip Jim and I over the edge. We just started shooting, and we kept on shooting until both of our weapons had completely run out of bullets. When our eyes were no longer obscured by the obnoxious muzzle flashes, the flashlight fell on what was seemingly the lifeless corpse of the beast that Reuben Grundy had turned into. We were both shocked, having expected him to attempt to flee the basement, or at least jump out of the way. The twisted monster now lay still among his quarries. The entire Torkin Police Department arrived half an hour later, and the deeply panicked, white-faced Detective Evans arrived another half hour after that. The whole cleanup operation took the better part of an entire week, but that first night was a harrowing ordeal, even for those who didn't have to scrape up the remains or lay eyes on the creature that was responsible. If it had been any other case, I would have relished the look of horror on Sheriff Alverson's face when he knew quite how badly he had handled everything, and the realization that he would have to deal with those fucking Hoover boys when a black SUV pulled up outside the crime scene. The expression on his face was one shared by everyone who had to wrap their heads around the fact that the near 8-foot-tall monster that was dragged out of that basement had been, at one point, Reuben Grundy. I was glad that the case had been closed, but I felt very little in the way of catharsis. Jim and I had come face to face with the unknown, and the unknown had filled our heads with something unforgettable. There are things darker than man out there. Things we can't control the way we can control the Dahmers and John Wayne Gacy's of the world. We may have put an end to Reuben Grundy's otherwise never-ending hunger, but whatever was inside him is still tearing its way through the forests and the mountains, searching for another viable host to infect with the burning rage it carries with it. I'm not so sure that we can always fight what we don't understand. When I was 8 years old, I saw someone in my bedroom closet. I saw something in my bedroom closet. My mother knew about it. She used to call it Corinthian specter, naming it after me, and using the word specter to teach me a new word since I didn't used to read much. I told her about it, but never called her in when it appeared. Those glowing yellow eyes and that disapproving sneer just paralyzed me in my place, pinned me flat to the bed. It's hard to explain. It was like a person made of shadow and hate instead of flesh and bone. My mother, of course, just told me it was my overactive imagination. After a few years, I thought the same, or rather, convinced myself of the same. It was easier to believe it wasn't real after we moved, as the thing didn't follow us to our new home. A tiny high-rise apartment in a bad neighborhood. I didn't mind, though, because I didn't see that heinous son of bitch lurking around anymore. I still felt it, though, its presence, but it was nowhere near as strong as before. That was until 11 years later. That's when this story takes place. This all happened a few years ago. I mean, back in the day. I was a 19-year-old hustler trying to make it in the game. At the time, I was soldiering up for this big player named Scene Demetrius. Big Scene wasn't like most of the dope kingpins that came and went in our part of town. He was a learned man, college-educated. But learned or not, he had to make his throne the same as those before him, on a foundation of bodies. He dropped maybe 24 poor bastards on his way to the top. He unified all the projects on the east side. Unified, meaning they were all under his thumb. Under his thumb, and under the threat of the gun, particularly that of his lethal, sociopathic enforcer, Chuck Norris Eunuch. I didn't need to be part of that bloodbath, seeing as that was before I got started slinging for the man. I had no choice but to work for him. If you wanted to sell product in the city, it better be Big Scene's crack or crank you were slinging, especially seeing as he had no rivals to put him in check. None left anyhow. All that changed, though, after this old player, Locky Lloyd Robinson, came back uptown. Robinson had once been the big shot in the East Side projects, but got convicted of aggravated assault and did a 10-year bit. With him gone and his crew dispersed, some incarcerated, some dead, some just out of the game, it was easy for Demetrius to seize the reins of power. You didn't say asterisked like that, though. Not to his or Eunuch's face, you didn't. And if he caught a whiff of someone spreading dissent, you knew there was hell to pay. Robinson hadn't even been released yet when Eunuch pulled my coat on the matter. I'd been steadily slinging on my corner that day, making good bread, when his truck eased up against the curb. I looked through the window and saw him. As usual, he was wearing a warm-up suit made of carmine polyester with white trim. He signaled with a tilt of his head for me to climb into the passenger seat. "What's good, Chuck?" I said, not too boisterously. Eunuch didn't have a sense of humor. Grim-faced, he replied with a curt nod. From his interior speakers, I could hear the play-by-play of some kickboxing tournament, maybe in Europe or some other place. Eunuch didn't listen to music. Didn't care for balls either. He was obsessed with that MMA asterisk and loved watching old kung fu movies too. He'd been taking karate and taekwondo classes ever since he had the money to do so. Before that, he mostly just read instructional books from the library and watched Bruce Lee movies to learn all the ill-fated maneuvers. I fucked a guy up pretty bad with this one takedown. I recall, after the dude had made a crack about his last name sounding like the word eunuch. Chuck was the only nickname you could call him without losing teeth. You didn't risk making cracks behind his back either. Eunuch was 6'2" and 200 pounds. All muscle and fist. "We've got a problem. Money," he said presently. He always called me Money. I don't know why. "You heard of Locky Lloyd Robinson?" I nodded. "Yeah, a big player from back in the day. He's getting out tomorrow." "Word?" I thought he was dead. Eunuch looked at me, flashing those light bluish eyes of his, which were more unsettling and intense than they were beautiful. Without saying anything, he turned one of the knobs on the dash, the volume of the commentator's voice now deafening. Knowing he had more to say, I leaned in closer. "Big Scene says he's got to go," he whispered in my ear. I almost didn't hear him with the volume so loud and the adrenaline already singing in my veins. But I did hear him and knew what he meant. This guy, Robinson, had to be gone, permanently, and I had to host the going-away party. For the first time ever, I heard Eunuch laugh. The sound was all high and cracking, like a kid. "Easy, fam," he said, having read the panic in my face. "I'm going to be there with you. Make sure it goes right. He ain't got no muscle, seeing as he's been in the joint all these years. That's why we've got to stomp on him now. Make sure he doesn't build up." I knew my voice would betray me, so I just nodded my head. I felt the adrenaline subside. If Eunuch was there, I knew he'd be the one taking Robinson out. Not me. Eunuch told me to come back to my corner tomorrow night, around 9. He'd pick me up, and we'd do what needed to be done. I should probably mention that around this time I wasn't living with my mother. Not anymore. She'd banished me from her new house after finding out I was dealing. Well, not her exactly, but her new bow-tie-wearing, Allah-worshipping husband. He'd never liked me from the jump, and I swear I never saw the man crack a smile. Not even once. At this time, I was mostly couch surfing with anyone who'd take me, mostly at the apartments of my crew's grandmothers. The truth is, I didn't mind. I was tired of hearing that poisoning your own people mess from my stepfather. I got to my corner at 8:30. It was already dark, being February, and colder than a witch's tit. I was dressed as nondescript as I could. A black hoodie with no logo, gray tired kicks, and washed denim jeans. My outfit was complete with a pair of leather gloves and a ski mask half wedged inside my back pocket, the other half dangling out like a bandana. It was cold, but I made sure not to wear anything too bulky. I didn't carry a piece. Eunuch said he'd provide the hardware. Plus, I didn't want to get myself violated. I didn't have a gun permit, but I had plenty of priors to land me in hot water if I got popped by the police. I did bring along a box of baby wipes, though figuring we'd be rolling in a stolen car and would need to wipe down the seats and steering wheel before ditching it. When I saw the unfamiliar tan SUV crawling up, I knew I was right. Eunuch had obviously boosted it. When I got in, he commented immediately on the box I was carrying. "Dan boy," he said, his voice high with that juvenile giggle of his. "I knew you were a Similac motherfucker, but got in." "It's for after," I said, "when we've got to wipe the car down. You know, for Prince." My eyes adjusted to the dark. I saw that Eunuch was wearing a navy blue and gray tracksuit. On top of his cornrows, rolled up to resemble a skull cap, was a wool mask. Man, ain't nobody going to investigate a stolen car, fool. The Honorable just make off with the insurance money and buy himself a new one. It ain't like the police in this town don't have enough murders to keep them occupied. I knew then, like I know now, that what he'd said wasn't necessarily true about the insurance company. Plus, if there was a stolen vehicle involved in a murder, you better believe the police would track it down. A lot of my awe and illusions over Eunuch vanished that night. I wondered how a guy who'd gotten away with so much blood on his hands could afford to be so careless. "Anyway," he said more evenly, peeling out into the road, "we're going to burn it before we jet." Was he being serious before or just playing with me? I'll never know. I do know this, though. No matter how careful or fierce, every gunslinger has his day. We drove east into Marlow Village. Eunuch told me Robinson's grandmother had a townhouse in one of the neighborhoods there, which was where he was most likely to rest his head. "We might not get to drop him off tonight," said Eunuch, steering us left into an intersection, and then onto Vine Street. "The word on the street is that there's a big coming home party. It'll probably go all night." Definitely, you ask me. Lloyd Robinson knew how to throw down. You know what I'm saying. So, we're just going to case the place and see who comes and goes so we know who we've got to lean on after the shit pops off. It's going to be all his people, but not all of them are players. So we're just going to watch and see. I felt both relief and tension hearing this. Relief that I wouldn't have to be a party to a man's death that night. Tension in that, as much as I hate to admit it, this caper had got me excited. The thing is, I'm one of those people who doesn't always think before they act. Don't get me wrong. I'm not a knucklehead, and I do come prepared when I can. It's just that I don't hesitate to do something that could be scary or dangerous, especially if there's a high reward in it. But especially if I know it's something I need to do. Thinking about it too much will make me lose my nerve. Always has. Just like when I got involved in drug dealing. I knew what rewards selling drugs for a big kingpin motherfucker like Sean Demetrius would bring me. Status, money, cars, and pretty women. I didn't think about all the despair and danger I'd face in life until I was in it. Scabby tweakers, stick-up boys, pregnant mothers trying to get their heads up with rent money. Now that we were closing in on Mrs. Robinson's home, the reality of being an accessory to a murder was hitting me hard in the stomach. We made a right onto Frederickson Lane, a narrow stretch of concrete with shabby rectangular homes cramped together on either side. Each house had an attached garage, but few had a car within. The odd abandoned vehicle was parked on the curb. A sorry yellow grass playground with a vacant basketball court sat a few dozen yards down the block. "Man, what the fuck?" Eunuch exclaimed in a shrill whisper. I squinted into the windshield, and my jaw must have hit the floor. We had stopped 10 feet from Miss Robinson's domicile, and couldn't believe what we saw. It was dead. Nobody was in front of the house. There was no music playing, no heads visible through the windows, not even wrappers or empty bottles littering the lawn. Just nothing. All we could see were a dozen welcome home balloons, still plump and inflated, scattered along the grass, and some pulpy pink streamers dangling from the front door frame. There was an orangish light glowing faintly from one window, probably the grandmother reading a book before bed. Other than that, there were no signs of jubilation, no signs of life, nothing. "Maybe we're too early?" I said, looking at Eunuch, but all his people were going to wait for him to come home. Surprise him, like, where the fuck is everyone? Maybe he sent them away. "This is Lloyd Robinson we're talking about, dog." We called him Lucky to be ironic and asterisked. I shrugged. Maybe his time in the joint changed him. Set him straight. Eunuch flashed those piercing eyes my way, the irises almost luminous in the dark. "Maybe," he muttered. "We'll sit on the house for a while. See what comes." The adrenaline was pumping again in me. Clearly, if the party had been a bust, and no one showed that night, we'd be making our move. Shit, I thought. Why can't we just get it over with? My right knee started pumping in place. I bit my bottom lip, hoping like hell that I'd never have to leave that car. The truth was, with all the time that had passed since Eunuch had told me we were going to do this, I'd lost my nerve. After an hour, the orange light flickered out. All was quiet and dark. Even the other townhouses surrounding us seemed vacant. If we were going to do business, now was the time. Without emotion, Eunuch said, "Reach under your seat." I did so. It took some fumbling and stumbling, but my fingers eventually found purchase, something cold and metallic taped to the bottom. I wrenched it free, making the tape squeal, then held it up so I could see. A 9mm hand pistol with a silver aluminum barrel and a black grip. By now, my knee was jackhammering, as was my heart. "Stop shaking your leg, fool," Eunuch barked. I forced my leg to stay still. "You know how to use one of those." I shrugged, which meant I knew I had to. Eunuch had trained me with paint guns in an abandoned warehouse on the south side, just like every other hustler under his wing, a year prior. That thing packs 13 with one in the chamber. Safety's near your thumb. "Where's yours, Chuck?" I asked, hating the fearful sound in my voice. Eunuch didn't reply. Instead, he tugged on the hem of his glove, fitting his fingers more comfortably inside the leather. "Big Scene wants you to do it." My breath caught in my throat. In that moment, I actually saw myself outside my body. The moment passed before I realized Eunuch was still talking. "Demetrius likes you. Money. Sees potential in you. But if you're going to be more integral to our organization, you need to step up. Don't worry. I'll be right here if anything happens." I stared down at the ugly chrome cradled in my hands. "But shouldn't I have a silencer? His grandmother's in there too." Eunuch shrugged. "I couldn't get a silencer. His grandmother got a hearing aid or something. So you should be good if she's asleep. If you're worried, shoot him through a pillow. That should muffle the blast some." There were a million other concerns and excuses I wanted to voice. But Eunuch had already peeled his mask down over his face and opened the driver's side door. Not seeing any way out, I put my own mask on and stepped into the street. It was not only dark when we breached, but also eerily quiet. Unable to help myself, I looked up at all the surrounding windows, 10 to 20 feet above us, and saw they were all unlit and shuttered. I got this feeling that something wasn't right. Not that feeling of being watched that people talk about, but the opposite. I felt like we weren't being watched by anyone. Like we were invisible, even to God. Like something horrible had happened, and we were the only people left on the planet Earth. We were now on the doorstep. Eunuch produced a monkey wrench from his right sleeve. Like a giant termite, its jaws chewed through the door handle and excavated the lock. The door drifted open past the dangling streamers. "There's no turning back now. Check all the rooms," hissed Eunuch into my ear. "Meet you back at the car." He then turned and swooped toward the SUV. Inside, the apartment smelled familiar. It smelled like my mother's house. Same cleaning supplies used for the furniture. Same soaps and oils used by the grandmother. Same ingredients for cooking. Thyme, fish, plantains, and cayenne peppers. The scent of a home-cooked meal made me nostalgic, lulling me into a false sense of security. I forced myself to snap out of it and scoured the living room. No light except for the black light over the fish tank and the moon through the blinds. No noise except the percolating tank filter. By now, I was shaking like a leaf. I shouldered up to the closest closed door and inhaled deeply. Holding my breath, I ripped it open and pointed the pistol inside. Bathroom. With my blood pressure through the roof, I ducked out and searched for the next closed room, worried someone had heard me. The thought that I might find the grandmother first, and worse, wake her, flashed through my panicked brain. But I shook it off. Too late for that. There's no turning back now. With what at the time I thought was luck, the next door I opened was a bedroom, and inside, sleeping soundly on the mattress, was Lucky Lloyd Robinson. I recognized him from a picture Eunuch had flashed me on his phone. The relief I felt for it not being his Grammy was fleeting, overshadowed by the roar of adrenaline as I crept toward him with the gun raised. He lay there, still as the bed linen, like some child's stuffed animal. My eyes could just see him in the moonlight through the window. He looked small, aged, and frail. Weak. His face was sallow and puckered, and his hair was matted and gray. I checked that the safety was off, then pulled back the hammer and pointed the gun. I stood by the foot of his bed. I didn't want to use a pillow to muffle the blast. I didn't want to get that close. At that moment, all I wanted was to have it over with and get the hell out of there. He didn't care if the neighbors or his grandma heard the shot. I didn't even care if it got back to me later on. I just needed this to be done. That's when it happened. I flinched, my finger almost pulling the trigger, when I heard a voice. I leaned closer and realized he moaned in his sleep. His time-ravaged face twisted with evident discomfort as he groaned and tossed. A nightmare, I guessed. I looked up, thinking I saw someone else in the room. On first glance, my mind registered a shadow, but I did a double take. That shadow had volume. It was three-dimensional, not flat to the wall, and was looming over Robinson's head. The clearer the figure manifested before my eyes, the more desperately Robinson groaned and trashed. When I saw the frowning lips and the glowing yellow eyes, I knew what it was, the specter. The thing that had haunted me when I was 8 years old, the thing that had never truly left me. It began floating away from Robinson and peering hard at me with that dark, brooding face. That admonishing, judging look. Then it did something I didn't remember it ever doing before. The black pupils sank and vanished into the yellow glow, the eyes now burning like flashlights. Those frowning lips evened out, then curled upward and parted, revealing a wide, too-perfect set of pearly white teeth. Grinning at me, the smile at first looked hungry, then, I don't know how. I knew it was mocking me. I felt as if I were 8 years old again, remembering that time I'd wet myself in gym class, and hearing the malicious, endless laughter of the other boys. I realized I wasn't imagining laughter. I could actually hear it in the room. It began as the children's voices from my memory, then sped up into a shrill, hissing sound, like a buzzsaw. It was malevolent and taunting. At my expense, It seemed to be coming from the specter. The smell of the apartment's kitchen, the ghosts of home-cooked dishes, grew more pungent, nauseating. My mask suddenly felt hot on my face, as though it were blistering my skin. I thought I was going to puke. The hideous, grinning thing crept closer, having seemingly grown legs. Skeletal arms hung at either side of its gaseous torso, the dark gray fingers clawing like knuckles, almost touching the floor. Its vaporous body solidified, and its hide was black and visibly slick. Then the skin grew scaly. The dark scales were hexagonal and as large as silver dollars. Within seconds, the scales hardened and shrank, like armor made of clay. They grew farther apart, revealing lines of fleshy space underneath. From no discernible source, a red liquid dripped down the space between the shrunken plates, like bloody raindrops down a window pane. And still that grinding, metallic laughter continued to pulsate in my head. My pistol was now aiming at the floor, dangling from my quivering fingers. The taunting maelstrom quieted and then disappeared. Then, through a hoarse, hollow voice, I heard it speak. Corinthian Jones. That was it. Able to move again, I spun from the room and sprinted out the front door before realizing I'd dropped the pistol. I dove into the SUV with Eunuch at the wheel, the engine humming. "What happened?" said Eunuch, gunning us out toward the main road. "It saw me," I sputtered out. Stupidly, I had torn off my mask and hurled it to the floor. "What? Somebody saw you?" It was in his room, beside the bed. What? There was someone else in there. We were now making our way up Vine. Yes, a bodyguard. Was he strapped? How many guys? I couldn't answer him. I was hyperventilating with hot tears streaming down my face. Money, what's good with you, bro? Just keep driving. But I sensed the car beginning to slow down. Eunuch eased right into a plaza parking lot. He stopped in front of a shawarma joint, which was closed at this hour. "Corinthian," I heard him say, laying his hand on my shoulder. "You need to tell me what happened in there." I gulped hard, forced myself to breathe evenly, and compose my thoughts. Probably through a lot of panting and gibberish, I told Eunuch what had happened. I don't know what I expected his reaction to be. The truth is, I should have lied. Before I was finished, he threw the SUV into reverse, screeched out onto the road, threw the gear into drive, and began hauling asses back to Frederickson Lane. "Wow, what are you doing?" I yelled, my heart punching through my chest. The car leaked as we plowed over the median. "Man, you lost your damn mind," he barked, his hands wringing the steering wheel like a chicken's neck. "You pissed your pants and ran out of there because you thought you saw a ghost. Man, you are a Similac motherfucker. Dan. Man, I'm telling you, I saw it. It's real. The only thing real about you is that lemonade sloshing around your drawers." It was only then that I smelled the sterile odor and felt the warm moisture against my thigh. Jesus Lord, I really had pissed myself off. We were then back on Frederickson Lane, outside the Robinson residence. "Never send a boy to do a man's work," Eunuch said to himself, reaching beneath his seat and pulling free a Glock. "You fucking stay here and keep the engine running." He opened the door. Desperate and maddened with fear, I lunged for him, grabbing at his shirt. "Please, Eunuch," I begged. "Please, Don." My words were cut off by a ferocious elbow on the bridge of the nose. Eunuch fired a second one, this one likewise meeting its mark. Stunned and blinded with tears, I went limp in my seat. But I was still conscious enough to hear Eunuch's warning. "Listen to me, you pea-smelling baby. After tonight, you'll be lucky if you end up being the lookout on the corner. But if I come out, and you aren't here with this car, you are smoking. I mean, you are deader than Bruce and Brandon Lee. Do you feel me?" "Yeah," I mumbled through splayed, bloody fingers. Satisfied, Eunuch stepped onto the road. I watched him sneak into the house, holding his gun in both hands like a policeman on TV. I then looked around, observing the buildings. The windows were still dark, and the blinds were drawn. I knew that a car screeching out from the lot wouldn't be enough to wake people, not in this neighborhood, but something felt very, very wrong. I then heard the scream. It was loud and piercing, but clearly from a man. I couldn't rightly tell, but somehow I knew it belonged to Eunuch. I then jumped in my seat, startled by the unmistakable sound of gunfire. Ducking low, I looked up at the townhouse, seeing the flash of 14 shots light up the front window. Acting on some supernatural urge, I swiveled my head around to the other houses. Still no lights on. No blinds were pulled back. Not even a dog barking. Even after that scream with 15 loud-ass pops. What the fuck was going on? It was deathly quiet then. Scary quiet. I wondered if I'd imagined all the commotion. If this entire blessed night was some God-forsaken dream. That silence was then broken by the woody creak of Miss Robinson's front door. I stared wide-eyed at the dark opening, waiting for Eunuch to come out. Instead, I was greeted by 2 glowing yellow orbs. That was it. Not needing another reason, I sped out of that lot like a bat out of hell. Motherfuck Eunuch and Robinson both. Fuck Demetrius too. I drove the boosted SUV all the way to the south side and parked beside an abandoned building. I still had the baby wipes, so I rubbed both seats and the steering wheel clean. It took me damn near an hour trying to get all the blood and urine out. By then, the blood flow from my nostrils had stopped. Though I could feel it was swollen and hurting like Dickens, I then hoofed it to the nearest bus stop. I couldn't go back to my crewmate's grandma's house, where I'd slept the previous night. I couldn't seek out any of Demetrius's people. Begrudgingly, I knew who I had to go see. This was going to be hell. My mother opened her front door on the 6th knock. "Corinthian Jones," said my mother. She spoke in that tone of voice they all have to make their kids feel like puppies that just spit on the rug. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. My mother and stepfather's home was an amber brick split house in Cedarwood, a neighborhood that looked damn near suburban. Middle-class folks, white, black, and brown, came to live here and raise their kids. My stepfather could afford the safe, cozy environment because he managed a warehouse for a trading company that wholesaled flower arrangements and moonlighted as an assistant manager for a Dairy Queen on weekends. "Ma," I muttered, not meeting her eyes. "Boy, why the hell are you out this late?" "Ma, I need your help." "Son," she said directly, making me look her in the eye. "You know your stepfather doesn't like you being here. You're not welcome in this house." "Ma," I pleaded, my voice all shaky and my eyes burning. "I need your help." I looked her right in the eye. She saw it. My fear. Her facial expression went from admonishment to worry in a heartbeat. "Come inside," she muttered. "Go into the kitchen. I'll make some tea." Stepping aside, she made room for me to slip past her into the house. I could never learn to enjoy being at my stepfather's house. Inside, it looked so sterile. Stiff leather cushions and glass furniture. It didn't smell of good food but of stale coffee and moist cardboard. It was good to see my mother again, though. She looked just as beautiful and strong as I remembered. I didn't tell her about the specter. Not at first. I just told her about seeing Demetrius and Norris Eunuch, how I'd fouled up and needed to lay low somewhere to avoid getting hunted down by their henchmen. They would seek me out and surely kill me for splitting on Eunuch like I did. For obvious reasons, I omitted the part about almost murdering a man in his sleep. "Okay, honey," she said, blowing on a hot mug of tea. "I'll call your Aunt Dana. She's got a place way up in the country where you can stay. I'll pack some clothes, and we'll leave in the morning." Anxious, I scratched the back of my head vigorously. "I need to go there now, meh. They might already be looking for me." My mother pursed her lips and then nodded. She stood from the couch and went to the kitchen phone, where she called my aunt, apologizing for the hour and explaining we were on our way. I was still freaked out but felt much calmer knowing I was getting out of the city ASAP. "Do you still have some of my clothes here?" I asked. She nodded. "We packed them away in the basement. I'll show you so we can get going." I got up, letting her guide me to the basement. She stopped just before the steps, turning around to face me. "You saw it again, didn't you?" she muttered. My flesh prickled, knowing what she meant. "What?" I balked, acting dumb. "When I saw you on the front porch just now, I saw that look on your face. I hadn't seen that expression on your face since we lived in that old house." I averted my eyes, trying to brush it off, but felt my hands begin to tremble. "I used to see it too," she whispered. I did a double take, examining her face, not sure what I just heard. "You," I began. "It used to hover over my bed late at night." She interrupted, her eyes downcast and her mouth drawn. "It never did anything. Never came close or even moved. It just stared down at me, glowering with those goddamn eyes. I don't know why, but every time I looked at it, it made me feel guilty or ashamed, like I was a bad mother or something." My throat constricted. I felt a damp lump form but swallowed hard, too used to showing no heart all the time to let myself be caught slipping. Even by my own mother. Even after I stopped seeing it, I knew it was still there, around me. Like the feeling you get just before you come down with a bad cold. Like the smell of the air before it rains. "Do you still see it, Mama?" She shook her head. "No. I haven't seen it for almost a year now." "You mean you saw it a year ago?" "Yeah, in this house." "Dag. But it's been gone." She nodded. My spirits lifted. "Really? When? What did you do to make it go away?" Without answering, she bit her lip and tossed her braids over one shoulder. "I stopped seeing it after I married your stepfather. We drove a solid 5 hours out of town until we reached my aunt's. May had me sit in the back with the luggage and told me to crouch down in case someone looking for me passed the car and peeked inside. I stayed at my Aunt Anna's for 6 months before feeling it was safe to come back. Before I moved back to the city, though, there was news from my hometown. While up in the countryside, I kept checking Google News and the papers at the local gas station, looking for any mention of Eunuch, figuring he'd been killed that night. I scanned the obituaries for his name, but came up with nothing. Instead, about a week later, I saw this headline: "City COPs make huge DWG bust. East Side Kingpin in TUSTO DY." I tore through the pages and found the full report. Seen Demetrius and his entire crew had been rounded up by the cops, dead to rights. The government had everything. The shipment of drugs, the guns, the ammo, even intimate details about the hits Demetrius had ordered. It was unreal. The guy had been so smart and careful, and everything seemed fine when I was there. How the hell did the cops bust him so fast? I got my answer a few days later. I followed the case in the papers and on TV as much as possible. They ended up giving Demetrius life without the possibility of parole. The prosecutors had a star witness, Norris Eunuch. According to reports, Eunuch committed everything. The drugs, the illegal firearms, even the murders, even testified in open court. I found out a few years later, while reading studies about the case, that Eunuch had agreed to testify without even being offered a deal. He hadn't been arrested or coerced by the police. He just went to the police station on his own volition and rolled over on everything, like he was going to McDonald's to order a hamburger. I found out he confessed to the cops the same night our hit on Robinson fell through. He didn't even get much lenience afterwards, seeing as he'd been the one who'd actually carried out the murders. Had to spend time in the joint just like Big Scene. Needless to say, he was killed about a week after Demetrius was sentenced. For years, this story has plagued me. What could possibly have made a cold-blooded gangster like Chuck Norris Eunuch turn himself in like that? A week ago, while reading up on the case, I found a clue. In this true crime article on the rise and fall of Scene Demetrius, they had the last known photograph of Eunuch before he died. It was a picture of him sitting on a bench inside a courthouse, just outside the chambers where he would testify against his former boss. In his face, it looked like the whole world had ended. In the right corner of the frame, just above his shoulder, was what looked like a shadow, but it was too thick and prominent to be a shadow, obscuring that side of the frame like a black cloud hovering over him. The photographer and editor had probably figured it had been some kind of technical glitch, like a smudge, but the tiny yellow pinpricks sitting parallel inside the black space told another story. I knew better. It was the thing. My specter hovered over Eunuch just before he took the stand to testify. Lloyd Robinson died a month after Demetrius's trial. Suicide. The Brothers of Drain was a Canadian-American commune, gang, and cult that was active in the northeastern regions of the United States and southern Canada, particularly New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, in the late 1990s. Led by Wolfville native Warren Drain, who occasionally used the alias Coda, they lived an unconventional lifestyle, largely aloof from civilization, and at times were violently hostile towards outsiders. It attracted an estimated following of 100 to 120 members, who were all men and boys who varied in age, ethnicity, and income, some even being homeless. Drain, who claimed that the cult was a revanchist organization, was known to make bizarre statements that suggested that he saw himself as the second coming of Jesus Christ and was revered as a god among his members. The cult was based on the teachings of Drain himself, who preached ideas associated with anti-establishment, social deviance, reclusiveness, misanthropy, and misogyny. Many of its members were orphans, runaways, drifters, ex-prisoners, gang members, or otherwise people who felt they were wronged by society. Many also sought to live off the grid in remote areas of the country, where they often practiced hunting, fishing, and primitive survival techniques while living communally. Drain encouraged his followers to live in the woods or other isolated areas, avoid mainstream society and its laws, and avoid interacting with anyone outside their group. In the late 1990s, the group was responsible for the disappearances of several local women, which encouraged discontent with their activities. An uprising on November 1, 1999, led to the deaths of several top-ranking members. The ones responsible for the uprising fled into the woods, where they were later discovered by law enforcement. Drain, meanwhile, was discovered in his bedroom, where he had slit his own throat. In 2005, several former teenage members of the Brothers of Drain, who led the uprising, started the charity organization Justice for the Lost, which donates all of its profits to victims of abuse as well as funds for counseling and spreading awareness of bullying, subcultures, gender rights, and LGBTQ tolerance. Notable members and associates: Warren Drain, Jacob Gallegos, Herbert Morehouse, Ernest Coffey Christopher, Kayatso Thomas McCoy, Niall Gottler, Damon Orlick, Ren Lingson, Derek Buckley, Joaquin Seco, Lou Chun, Richard Perkins, Andrew Pittman, Ryan Keller, Harada Mitsuhide, K.J. Dunlop, Jamar Joliffe Calvin, Henley Jesse, Hood Manuel Alarcon, Gabriel Ramirez, Tyler Cole Vihan, Helsted History, Warren Drain. In 1989, then 19-year-old Warren Anthony Drain was a homeless teenager living in the slums of Wolfville, Nova Scotia, Canada. It is speculated that he was estranged from his mother, who was known to be tense, abusive, and prone to violent outbursts. He was closer with his father, Harrison Anthony Drain, and his half-brother Alex, whom he moved in with a year prior after he could not handle his mother any longer. During this time with his father, Drain kept a secret journal in which he wrote about many different things, including his discontent and hatred for people, especially women and children, his love of death, and personal scientific essays about creating a new brand of man. An excerpt from his journal, discovered by police in 1999, "No one is worthy of this planet. The world is polluted and no one cares. All humans do is destroy, destroy, and destroy. All they care about is themselves. Life is a bitter scramble to the top for all classes of people. Take women, for example. It is nature, The force that goddamn Mother Nature fucking set up for women to be the lower class. They are weaker and subservient. But no, every woman on planet Earth wants to kill men. In, say, 100 years, I bet men will be at the bottom of the chain. There will probably be a massive shift where women now rule the world and use men for labor. Women will probably inject themselves with something that will grow them a dick. All men will become sex slaves. They will force us to beg at our knees for that dick, sucking them off all naked and such while they grab our throats and say, "You're not so tough anymore." Or maybe there will be a massive genocide of all men. Something as simple as that. Just you wait. After flunking out of high school, Drain was kicked out of his home by his father, who was enraged that his son did not graduate from high school and could not find a stable job. Feeling banished, Drain eventually sold many of his belongings, including his blue Ibanez G10 electric guitar, but it did not earn him much money back. Now living on the streets, he eventually fell in with a teenage street gang, led by someone known only as Damien. Damien's gang members included Dingo, a 17-year-old thief and younger cousin of Damien, and G-Man, a 23-year-old petty criminal who was formerly imprisoned in jail for grand theft auto. The four lived in an abandoned warehouse that was crumbling and had broken walls covered in graffiti. It was located in a dangerous neighborhood where shootouts would regularly be heard. Drain and Damien were very well acquainted, and Drain soon became Damien's confidant and best friend. Damien's gang had its own code of honor, wherein they were expected to not only steal for the gang, but also to protect each other and others in the community. Drain admired this sense of camaraderie between the members and would later adapt this idea into his cult. Damien's gang was soon recruited by a new pimp in the neighborhood, a 34-year-old drug dealer named Big John. John was not a pimp, however. He was simply a businessman, supplying recreational drugs and other illegal commodities to street gangs. Drain went back numerous times and bought marijuana and heroin, eventually entering a full-scale addiction. He isolated himself from his other gang members, sometimes disappearing for days on end. Continuing to write in his journal, an examination of this time period revealed that Drain's former antagonistic thoughts turned into murderous fantasies. He discussed ways of punishing women for their insolence, as well as topics such as natural selection and a master race that only he was a part of. During this same period, Drain was frequenting a drug den called the Crystal Palace, which was a hangout for many young adults. Here, they would often discuss their hatred of people and the idea of power. They would often make charged and violent comments regarding women, homosexuality, and politics. As his addiction progressed, Drain eventually lost contact with the other members of his gang. G-Man, who is the only surviving member of the original gang, later stated in 2009, "Him and Damien, were tight, but we never saw much of him after he got involved in that shit. From what we saw of him, he looked like a skeleton that would break apart in a second. We didn't break up on bad terms or anything. One day we saw him, and the next he was gone forever." Drain drifted for several months as a homeless young man through Nova Scotia, abusing heroin and stealing from people to get money for his addiction. He slept under a bridge in Middleton by the ocean. On March 2, 1990, he made a deal with a local gang that he would do odd jobs for them in exchange for heroin. When he failed to do them, though, he was beaten up in an alleyway. This experience led him to take matters into his own hands. Formation Drain began formulating his own philosophy based on a mixture of Luciferianism, occultism, incel, misogyny, and sadism. His first follower was a 21-year-old fellow drug addict named Jacob Gallegos, who shared Drain's views. They became best friends and eventually scraped together enough money to live together in an apartment. Drain and Gallegos soon began to attract small crowds of listeners and some dedicated followers. They targeted males for manipulation who were emotionally insecure, social outcasts, and / or incels, and had bad experiences with women. One such individual was a 12-year-old runaway named Jesse Hood. According to Hood, Drain told him that he could have the woman with no strings if he joined him in Galagos. Hood paid this amount and left his family. Michael Hood, Jesse's father, tried to find his son everywhere, but was never able to. After gaining a small but devoted following of just 5, which included a 23-year-old Chinese immigrant named Lu Chun, a 22-year-old Acadia University graduate named Niall Gottler, Hood, Galagos, and Drain, they left the Nova Scotia area and took off on the road. Drain became the main voice, but the 4 other members served as his aides. Drain preached that being born again was paramount to true happiness and that they were the only true beings. He began to refer to himself, Galagos, Hood, Chun, and Gottler as Archbloods. The gang soon expanded to New Brunswick, northern Maine, and New Hampshire, where they focused on recruiting homeless and emotionally unstable men. Living off the radar in the woods, they began to attract more followers, most of whom were mentally ill, drug addicts, alcoholics, and those living on the edge of society. Drain began to present himself as a guru or shaman. His appearance during this time was considered to be very Jesus-esque, meaning he had long brown hair and a beard. He preached that humans were becoming more and more weak, and that he was chosen to lead those whom he chose back to a more godly and just life. Drain also spoke of an impending gender war that he would lead, where all women would be killed off and the earth would be ruled by a collective, all-male society. He decreed that all of his followers should refrain from pornographic material and romantic interests, even masturbation. 1993 to 1995. Around 1993, the group purchased a large cabin in the mountains of northeastern Maine. They named it The Compound and kept a low profile. Drain began to hold regular meetings there for 2 to 3 weeks at a time. Meetings were held in an enclosed room in the back, where there were no windows. Members were usually not allowed to leave the grounds except for trips for groceries or recruiting. When a member left, they wore masks or bandanas to hide their faces. They even had custom uniforms they had sewn themselves, consisting of a black dress shirt with a red scarf. Many members were ordered to do things that Drain had taught them as part of the training. Drain did not believe in working as an individual but in leading others. Reports that Drain was an oppressive and violent leader early into investigations were actually falsified. According to several members, he was actually quite caring and sensitive to his followers' needs. Drain made it clear he would prefer for his followers to be happy and actually enjoy their lives in the cult instead of just using it as an escape. During this time, the group made several VHS tapes, mainly of Drain giving speeches, and a few documentaries of the group's rituals. They also made a few 8mm films of Drain speaking alone, and of the group's history. One was an initiation tape. In that video, Drain had a special robe he would put on and talk about religion. He would talk about the history of the human race and how humans came to be. They were now also referring to themselves as the Brothers of Drain. In 1994, the group nearly doubled in size, now attracting older men as well as young men. Some new members included 48-year-old truck driver Herbert Morehouse, 62-year-old former Sheriff Ernest Coffey, 21-year-old Japanese permanent resident Harada Mitsuhide, and runaway teen Jamar Joliffe. Drain began to introduce rituals into the cult, including blood oaths and carving symbols into their bodies with knives. When undergoing treatment in March 2003, Jesse Hood was found with numerous symbols scored into his arms, including a swastika and a rudimentary upside-down cross. After abandoning the compound, they traveled up and down New England, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia to stay one step ahead of the police and curious locals. They are thought to have gone as far south as Plymouth, Massachusetts, and as far north as Dingwall, Nova Scotia. Oftentimes, they would either buy abandoned properties or cottages and simply camp out in the wilderness for months on end. Murder of Logan Rockwell on June 13, 1995. Teenage member Logan Rockwell was discovered to have a secret girlfriend. Local Bethany Sharp. According to Hood, Rockwell was brought before Drain, who stabbed him in the heart. Drain ordered Rockwell to be decomposed and buried in an unmarked grave nearby on the property. Final years and uprisings for the next 4 years. The Brothers of Drain grew to 120 full-time members. The men had become entirely self-sufficient, growing their own food, hunting, and fishing. They began to make extensive purchases of rifles, military-grade explosives, and even an illegally purchased rocket launcher. Members wore various paramilitary uniforms, ranging from police riot gear to fatigues. To pay for all of their expenses, Hood and other members would regularly sell off their possessions, including their cars. All of this would go towards funding the cult's activities. However, Drain's behavior started to become more erratic and strange, sometimes to the point where his preaching did not even make sense, leading some in the cult to start to secretly defy their leader. Despite the fact that the members would continue to follow Drain's instructions, they were still disgruntled. This was only accelerated with what Drain called rides, beginning in early 1998. Rides were forceful abductions of local women, usually late in the night as they walked home from work, or were otherwise coerced somehow by members of the cult. They were brought back to wherever the Brothers of Drain had set up their base of operations and were drugged and locked in either a bedroom or the basement. However, none of the women, who all wished to remain unnamed, reported any sexual activity between any of the male members. Instead, they were simply chained and beaten, starved, and sometimes had their heads shaved. Jesse Hood, along with other teenage members, refused to get involved and would act like they were preoccupied with something else. Hood would later go on to describe the crimes they had committed as sickening. I wish that pain upon no one. Eventually, Hood, along with fellow members Brian Keller, K.J. Dunlap, Andrew Pittman, Calvin Henley, and Manuel Alarcon, began to organize a rebellion. They were horrified at what their group had become. They never intended to kill or otherwise harm anyone. Realizing they had been tricked and coerced by Drain's clever scheming and the gravity of their situation, they decided in secret that they were going to assassinate top-ranking members of the cult, including Drain, Gallegos, and Gottler, free the women and bring them safely, and destroy the cult once and for all. Late in the night on August 4, 1999, Hood, Keller, Dunlap, Pittman, Henley, and Alarcon armed themselves with anything they could, including knives, hammers, and pistols. Hood, Keller, and Dunlap slowly individually entered the rooms of Drain, Gallegos, and Gottler. Before any of them made a move, Gallegos and Dunlap had a brief physical altercation before Gallegos shot Dunlap dead with a revolver. This led to chaos as loyal members started to awaken to see what was happening. Pittman, Henley, and Alarcon, meanwhile, managed to free several of the women besides one, who was shot dead by Drain as she tried to escape into the forest. Gottler fell off the roof of the cabin to his death while chasing Keller. Hood was not able to kill Drain, later stating that Drain literally just pushed me out of his room and locked the door. I tried to break it open, but it was no use. He always was a pussycat. He was 29 at the time of his death. After being chased out of the property by loyal members of the cult, Hood, Keller, Pittman, Henley, and Alarcon, along with the women, managed to lose them and came to an open highway where they waited for hours for someone to see them. They finally managed to get the attention of a family driving a minivan, who took them in and drove them to a hospital and then a police station. After getting details from the boys and women, several nearby police departments in both Maine and New Brunswick led a raid on the property hours later. Many of the cultists were either killed in a brutal shootout that followed and lasted for nearly a half hour, or were arrested while trying to flee. Police found Drain and Gottler dead, a loaded assault rifle on the bed beside Drain, and several other weapons in the house, including a machine gun and 2 rifles. Many cult members were detained at the county jail in nearby South Portland and charged with nearly 5 counts of kidnapping, as well as attempted and aggravated murder. Gallegos was shot in the shoulder during the shootout, but managed to survive. Belief System Core, a former member of the Brothers of Drain, who prefers to remain unnamed, has described the group's theology and its practices. Former member: "We were always taught to worship Warren as if he were a god. He saw himself as a savior, a liberator, a guardian, or whatever. In some ways he was. Many of us were orphans, street kids. We didn't know what else to think. He took us in and cared for us like no one else did. He saw himself as someone who would have all of us be free of oppression, free of the need to work, and free of hate. We saw Warren as the one true God. He was everything." Interviewer: "What were some of his practices? What did he preach to you?" Former member: It was all over the place, really. His main point was that we were stronger as one, not as many. We were a sort of collective unit, a brotherhood, I guess. We all had a story, some of us worse than others. We were only supposed to interact with each other, not anyone else outside of the commune. Warren said he would lead us to salvation, but only if we were willing to join him for the ride. Everyone was an idiot. No human being was worthy enough for this world. In Warren's mind, he wanted to get rid of all the arrogant, rich, creepy, terrible, and no good people in the world. I remember, too, that he was very against women in all aspects. None of us were allowed to have girlfriends or wives. If we did, we were punished. Porn and shit wasn't allowed, although some of us broke it from time to time. Laughs. The ideology of the Brothers of Drain was a sort of blend of anti-establishment, isolation, social deviance, misanthropy, misogyny, and incel, and Drain would lead his fellow brothers to a new utopia, where everyone was equal and all men were accepted into this society. He instilled in his followers the belief that he was godlike in power, a guiding spirit to darkness. He even claimed that he was the second coming of Jesus Christ. Members were to worship him wholeheartedly. This meant that no other religions were allowed, including atheism or agnosticism. They were to follow only Drain, or they'd be punished and left behind. They were taught how to sink into their environment and how to avoid social connections. They sink into the background and become indistinguishable from the mass of people and untouchable. As such, they were taught to be cold and callous. They learned how to walk the earth without a care in the world, and how to be invisible. They were taught to be cunning and clever. They learned that humans are inferior and that they themselves are to be worshipped, adored, and followed blindly. We were told that the human species were the scum of the earth, and that he, Drain, would purify us of their filth, says Richard Perkins, a former member. Claims of neo-Nazism have been denied since several former members said that Warren was indiscriminate against race or ethnicity. Views on women in particular, Warren Drain harbored a particular resentment against women and girls. He taught that men were superior to women. It was the men, after all, who made the rules, claims a former member, and the women were just mindless, obedient, and submissive. The cult's views on sexuality and politics were shaped by the belief that women had an especially sacred position in the world. According to them, women were submissive, meek, and weak, and they were to be treated like toys. Sexuality was considered a different matter, however. Members were not allowed to have girlfriends, wives, or even children, and they were not permitted to look at pornography. If they had children before they joined, the member could either allow only the son into the cult or abandon his children altogether. Drain considered the former to be better, and he would take care of the sons of other members. In the cult's view, feminism was evil. Feminist writers were read in order to understand that men and women were not created equally, and how women were trying to gain a more prominent position in the world. A cult member recalled, "We read everything by Isabel Allende. We even had a few books by a feminist named Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They had a special shelf in the library. Regarding why they even had these books in the first place, some have suggested that Drain liked to torture himself this way. Remarks made by the women who were kidnapped in 1998 and 1999 suggest that no attempts at sexual harassment were made by the cult on the women. In fact, the cult seemed disgusted by the women's appearances alone. They wanted barely anything to do with us other than break our spirit. Aftermath investigation and trial and official search of the property that housed the compound, including several other locations that the Brothers of Drain used as bases, yielded many documents that described Warren's philosophy and his plans for supposed world dominance. Other things that were found included the VHS tapes. Only a select few were released to the public in 2003. A number of photographs of different members, several letters to Drain from associates, an extensive collection of occult books, several books by Nazi and fascist authors, and about $9,000 in cash. The Brothers of Drain claim that the money and materials were payment for training. Most of the notes were written by Drain, although others were in other languages. The most prominent was Drain's own, which discussed the philosophies of both Satanism and his own beliefs. Other notes included a list of various items, such as military hardware, explosives, body armor, and weapons, as well as a plan of action in case they were ever discovered. After the cult was shut down, only 76 members were recorded alive from the nearly 120 at its peak. Many were found unfit to stand trial, suffering from various diseases and mental illnesses, such as PTSD, dissociative personality disorder, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and psychosis. All but 13 of those who were charged with crimes refused to testify, and only 3 individuals pleaded guilty. Some found it difficult to readjust to normal society again, leaving them in a state where they are afraid of even going outside. Former members are still institutionalized all around the United States and Canada, even to this day. Jacob Gallegos was one of those who pleaded guilty and was charged with aggravated kidnapping, assault, and mental scaring of a child, Hood, and other teenage members. He was sentenced to death on April 2, 2000, and awaits his execution. Survivors and Justice for the Lost, JFTL, Jesse Hood, Brian Keller, Andrew Pittman, Calvin Henley, and Manuel Alarcon were all taken into police custody after they admitted their crimes and the ordeal that happened, but they were never tried and arrested. In fact, all were hailed as heroes after their escape. K.J. Dunlap was also honored, with a statue of him being erected in Wolfville. In 2005, after years of coping, they started a charity organization called Justice for the Lost, JFTL, which aims to combat and spread awareness of bullying in schools and elsewhere, as well as child abuse and tolerance and acceptance of LGBTQ youth. Media depictions books. This is My Apology, 2008. The autobiography of Jesse Hood before and during his time in the Brothers of Drain films. Brothers of Drain, 2013, is a Jason Lee-directed film chronicling the life of Warren Drain in the early years of his cult.